The White House said, we are inviting His Majesty and 8 of his retinue. And we took that to the king, and particularly to his advisors. They looked at us and we looked at them, and there was going to be no way there would only be 8. Well, one thing led to another, and by the time they got on the ship, there were about 80.
After arriving in New York, King Saud and his entourage flew to Washington. Saud became the first Saudi monarch invited to America on a state visit.
Eisenhower met him at the airport, which was very, very unusual, and he just determined that he was going to treat Saud as his great good friend.
Eisenhower wanted a renewal of the lease on the Daron airbase, a useful strategic asset in the Cold War. King Saud wanted the money that the U.S. would pay to extend the lease.
My father at the time, was negotiating the agreement. He was very sensitive to not calling it a base. It was a transit place for the Americans to take fueling, period.
The exact details of the Daron agreement are revealed in this original copy of the accord. This agreement constitutes, until today, the basis of U.S.-Saudi military cooperation.
In exchange for our free use of the Daron airfield, they wanted all kinds of materials. They wanted tanks, for one thing, and they wanted training, and they wanted planes, and they wanted anything we would give them.
The agreement was celebrated with great pomp. King Saud was given full honors.
The official visit was glittering and fine, but when it was all over, one sort of felt, what is this all about? Because he's clearly not the man for this.
King Saud was a failure in part because of his alcoholism. It made the cover of Time. He was certainly not his father's greatest creation. His successor, King Faisal, on the other hand, was very impressive.
Eisenhower's plan to build up Saud as the alternative Arab leader seemed doomed to fail. King Saud spent much of the money from the Daron lease on luxury trips to Europe. A rift was fast developing in the family.
His extravagance wasn't the big issue. Kings can be extravagant and still remain king. The big issue was the running of the government. That was the biggest problem. It was all personal.
We were really worried about Saudi Arabia. I mean, I'm not talking just about Aramco. I'm talking about the people in the U.S. government and everybody were worried about Saudi Arabia, and we realized that if anybody was going to save Saudi Arabia, it was going to be Faisal. And a lot of people worried, as we did, living in Riyadh, that there'd be a kind of a civil war.
The Al Saud brothers realized that something had to be done.
The step of removing a monarch is something that is not lightly taken by anyone. It is a very serious, very dangerous step. Removing one monarch, well, you can always remove another.
So the brothers all got together. Well, it was their own best interest. They had to make a move. And they decided in November of '64 to go to the religious leaders, and they decided this is the way they could do it.
And they got a fatwa from the religious leaders sanctioning the abdication and sanctioning Faisal's taking over the throne.
Once more, the Saudi monarchy was saved on the brink of disaster by the ulama.
The family decision to depose Saud in the 1960s was really more of a turning point than the death of Abdul Aziz in 1953, because it was finally coming into the modern world, but also proving that the desert democracy of sitting around the campfire and the family picking the toughest man for the job could work in the 20th century, and the speed which the change was actually accomplished and the new direction that the country took. That, I think, was the decisive turning point in the history of Saudi Arabia in the middle of the 20th century.
King Saud and his entourage were quietly asked to leave the country. The ailing Saudi monarch spent his last years exiled in Athens, Greece.
And that was that. No more King Saud and his alcohol and weakness. Faisal, his brother, of course, he's his half-brother. They all have different mothers, which is why none of the Saudi boys really look like any of their other brothers. Faisal is an entirely different person altogether from his half-brother Saud. He modernizes the country, as we are going to see, in ways that would have seemed absolutely impossible even a decade or two earlier. So, let's meet our new king, Faisal.
It was my first year at Georgetown, 1964. I was called in by the dean of the university, who, when I went in the office, I thought I had done something wrong or something. And he said, well, now, Turkey, your situation has changed, and are you thinking that perhaps we could provide you with bodyguards? In those days, there was no internet, there was no instant news service. I had absolutely no idea that on that day, Monday, that my father had become king.
King Faisal had a lot to do. But almost every aspect of bringing the kingdom up to date was bound to bring him into conflict with the ulama. In their view, every innovation threatened Islam.
Essentially, modernity means westernization. This is the fact. It's like a buzzword, okay? Modern means westernized. This is where we have problems, because people want to run their lives better, but not necessarily sacrificing their own culture and their own history in order to become copies of Frenchmen or copies of the English or false Americans. They don't want that.
He decided that there should be girls' schools in Saudi Arabia, and there was an uproar about it. All the old fathers came along and said this was awful. Who knew what would happen when the girls got education? And Faisal said, in that case, don't send your daughters to schools. And if you don't want, if a majority of people in your village or town don't want a girls' school, you won't have one. But those who do want to have a school must have one.
I would have been illiterate if they didn't have schools at the time. And in fact, I was lucky to go to one of the early private schools that were established in the 60s. Female education was put under the directory of a separate body that would control the curriculum and make sure that what the girls are taught in schools is actually suitable for them as girls and as women. So in that way, he managed to reconcile the need for female education and also the requirements of the ulama.
Gradually, indeed, the number of girls' schools was increased, and then girls were admitted to universities and so on. All this was done by keeping just a little way ahead of public opinion and always being willing to stop and wait for public opinion to catch up.
But reaching compromise with the ulama was a constant battle. Leading Wahhabi clerics were ever vigilant.